We're going to start in a slightly light note today. There was an article in the New York Times about a small town outside of Phoenix in Arizona, which has gone big on the marijuana industry. And why that's catches attention is because it's a very strongly Mormon town. The Mormon faith is spread throughout the Southwest and Utah, of course. And they're extremely, well, their alcohol is banned, as is caffeine. And the Church of the Latter-day Saints Church has been very active, for example, in California, in politicizing and militating against legalization of marijuana. So there's a small town in Arizona, which is going big on marijuana. And the Times tells the story behind it. A man named Fife, a name I haven't heard before, Symington I've heard before because Symington's father was governor of Arizona and he was a Democrat. That was before Arizona became Republican, although it just turned Democrat, although that's a big controversy that we won't get into. So Fife Symington decided that this town was a perfect place to grow marijuana, and Arizona had legalized medical marijuana. And Fife Symington really seemed to be committed to this. The article doesn't say where that comes from, but he actually moved to the town in 2016 because he realized he'd have to do a lot of groundwork in his town to get marijuana as a product accepted. There had been a large greenhouse, extremely large greenhouse that grew tomatoes. That business had failed. He purchased that. It had a lot of sunlight in Arizona. There was good aquifer for water. He felt he was on good ground. Now all he had to do was get it past the town council to grow marijuana. And, you know, he himself was not a politician, but he seems to have good skills in that direction. And he brought in a political person from his father. And eventually the town council voted to permit them to create a marijuana business. The mayor was opposed to it. However, after a couple of years, they not only legalized medical marijuana, they legalized recreational marijuana, and business really took off. They interviewed the plant manager, and the plant manager said, I used to work in companies where if we grew the business 5 to 7% in a year, everybody was singing the Hallelujah chorus. Our business jumped 400%. Which brings up an interesting topic. People seem to want to smoke marijuana and take drugs. And on the one hand, you might say, well, that's what people are afraid of. That's why we don't legalize drugs. On the other hand, why do people want to take drugs? Is that a natural impulse? And who gets off saying, well, they can't take drugs, which is a big libertarian question. So back to this town, after the business took off, the mayor changed his mind, and Fife Symington applied to build a giant plant next to the one they already have, and the mayor led the crusade or the charge in accepting it. And the very last quote: "There's a really hardcore contingent of Mormons, and they run the kind of historical society that emphasizes cultural heritage." And they interviewed this one woman who headed that, and she said, well, you know, I was opposed to it, and I certainly don't want to see the town go completely into the business of producing marijuana, but people have to work. And the bottom line of all of this is a process of normalizing drug use. I mean, you know, regular people work there, they produce marijuana, people smoke marijuana, and there are no great changes that result from that. They're good contributing citizens. And then as a result, something that in my lifetime could get you arrested and thrown out of college and put in jail, and it still can, has now just become, well, whatever, you know, Mormons say, all right, if some people can get a work out of that, let's do that. But that hasn't happened with painkillers and heroin. Somehow that storyline remains unchanged. And you and I have already discussed Carl Hart's efforts in that direction to point out that, you know, obviously the data are that people take painkillers in droves and a minuscule number of them become addicted or have harmful effects, which used to be well known, but there's been a reverse trend against being aware of that. And with heroin, we've never changed the tide of understanding that heroin is just a substance that many people have taken with a variety of outcomes. That narrative, that myth in America, it's not going to be reversed in your or my lifetime. It's deeply so ingrained, and with Carl Hart's as prominent and visible as Carl is, he's not going to change that story. And if that story doesn't change, that story is, well, you take heroin and you sort of take painkillers, which is sort of funny because virtually everybody in America is taking painkillers and hasn't become addicted. But somehow that story is leached, the heroin story is leached onto painkillers. And if you take it, you uncontrollably become addicted. Anything you can do to stop that is justified. And it's some kind of special biological, medical process that only medicine conceivably can cure. And so we're going to lead into a couple of other topics. I maybe will only mention it briefly. One reason the narrative never changes, I mean, Carl Hart's prominent, but he's not a television series. And there have been hundreds of television series that are predicated on the idea that if people spread heroin and of course lately painkillers, then you're just going to spread like wildfire addiction. And people can't avoid that. And Netflix has a series now called The Pharmacist, which is somewhat predicated on that concept. There are people out there selling pain pills. They're addicting everybody. They can't stop it. People are dying left and right. And with that thing out there, there's no chance of ever reversing a narrative to put addiction and drugs in a reasonable focus. One where we can understand that drugs are one experience, a concentrated, powerful experience that can be the basis for addiction, but most often is not, and is most often overcome when people have normal lives and an opportunity to express themselves and to get beyond that. It puts it in a special category. And I think you wanted to use that, perhaps this serves as a launching pad for how therapies supposedly that address directly this mythical beast of drug addiction that can't be forestalled by any normal human self-restraint or life conditions or developmental maturity. It must be fought in a battle of medicines. And in that battle, people, since they can't control their narcotics use, any type of pressure which is placed on them to take some of these therapies is justified. So does that segue into what you've been thinking about lately?
Beautifully. And actually, you touched on something. I don't know if you've read Carl's book yet, but you know enough about him that you know the book. But one of the things that he mentioned was what you're saying. Well, I'm kind of speaking out against this. I'm happy to do it. I know it's a risk, whatever. I can't be the only one doing it. And I'm not a television series. He didn't say those words, but it's basically what he said. And he mentioned that, from comedians on sitcoms or television shows, things that we all are just so familiar with, they give people that use drugs the archetypes, false archetypes that we've clung on to and just repeat over and over, and it's kind of lazy. And he mentioned that he likes to go to comedy. He thinks of really good comedians, like think Lenny Bruce, but people of our times as people who can take so honestly what our flaws are. Something about comedy says, oh, this is how we're all screwing up right now, or this is what's going on, and no one talks about it, but I'll talk about it, and we can all kind of laugh at it. Bad comedians, lazy comedians, are people, well, maybe they're not lazy comedians generally, but a lazy joke would be something like, talking about stupid burnout stoners, or people who use heroin as always having a needle in their arm, not knowing, what time it is, or what's going on, or they're just so completely deprived that anyone would use drugs.
Or
yeah.
that anybody who even touches heroin is obviously, or anybody who uses heroin is obviously addicted to it. That's the only category that's allowed out there, even by comedians. And you're not going to see even the most daring comedians talk about somebody shooting up heroin as just a normal life process.
That's exactly it. It's funny how daring some people can be with some topics. It's like, but this is so embedded that even if people have a dissenting view, they wouldn't dare touch that. They'll go ahead and slip themselves nice in the nice warm blanket of drug mythology.
And we've talked about that in the context of Maya Salovitz and the drug policy reform movement, which is here to try and change our whole approach and way of thinking about drugs. And Maya's bestseller about how we think about addiction. And yet at some bedrock level, they are built on the same assumptions of drugs controlling people unavoidably. If you take something repetitively or regularly, you're obviously addicted. And we must, again, I think we're going in the direction you want to go to, can only fight it with some kind of a medical cure. That's
exactly.
the answer.
Exactly. So it does more, those bad stories do more than just hurt people's feelings. No one, in some ways, like no one really cares. I care, but it's like, that's not the big rub here. Problem is that the stories influence everything we do. Good rhetoric influences everything, and including treatments. So if someone does run into problems, which people do run into problems, that's why the mythology can continue fueling itself, is because there are real problems and people aren't really parsing what they are or what they mean or how they start or how they're fixed. Now it's gotten to, there's certain ways that you're supposed to treat this, and the treatments are based on the stories, and the stories are bad. So you don't have to leap too far to get into sort of coerced treatments, like meaning if somebody is having trouble with drugs or addiction to something, the state or maybe somebody higher up can say, I know better than, or maybe a doctor can say, I know better than you what you need, because, well, this is the story and you're saying it's not, and here's what you need to do. So drug courts, AA, and the things that get funneled into those, medication assisted therapies or AA sort of influenced treatments, like somebody getting fired from a job, or somebody given the false choice between being fired from a job, let's say a doctor, a dentist, a pilot, someone like a white collar gig, saying, well, you need to go to treatment if you want your license back. Or a blue collar worker, which we work with all the time, and says, well, you need to go to some sort of mutual aid group, because we know that if you're in a mutual aid group, then you're doing the right thing. And so two big things I want to talk about, which doesn't run the whole gamut, are AA and MAT. It's something that I've talked to you about. This fellow, Rick Barnett. He's a psychologist here in Vermont, quite prominent psychologist here. He was president of the APA for Vermont. He's pretty commonsensical. He's kind of an AA leaning guy if he had to lean on one or the other. He's sort of disgusted with both, though, because he has people come in his office saying, well, my work wants me to do this, or the court wants me to do this, but I don't want to. And there's something about his nature, Rick's nature, that says, well, how am I going to force you to do that? And so he won't. So he and I get in this discussion all the time about, he really wants to believe that there's something about AA that's like stoic and good and gives people a network to plug into, or gives people scaffolding for their lives they might not have had before. But he can't seem to marry that to the idea, the truth, that AA influenced therapies are things that people are funneled into by coercion. And so I want to start there. I should really stop talking because, okay, I can tell you about my experiences and what I've seen and people I've talked to, but you've written books about this, you've interviewed people, you've given people counseling and legal help for these things. So I'd like to turn it to you, see if I could get something out of you about this.
Archie Charles Bufe and I wrote a book. I don't know if I call it a classic. It was a manual called Resisting 12-Step Coercion. And one of the things that points to is that the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on the topic, but every state court that has ruled on 12-step therapy or AA, and the state forcing people into it, the state being prison, so that you can only get parole or probation if you're arrested for DUI, and they say, well, we'll put you on probation as long as you go to AA. Every single case of that has been declared illegal on the basis that the First Amendment, there's not actually a freedom of religion clause. There's the state cannot be involved in religion. And of course, AA people say, well, there's no religion in AA. Where does that come from? That whole higher power and turning yourself over to a higher power, that's not religion. And every court says, we know AA is great, but that's religion. Selling people to turn themselves over to a higher power. And then you say, oh, you don't have to really count that as a higher power. But that's what it says. And
there's something wrong here, though. I know that's true. The idea that it hinges on those cases hinge on the religion factor rather than the coercion factor is troubling to me.
That's really a great point, because New York State is one place where both the state and the federal courts have said you can't force people into AA as a religious grounds. And I actually had a case. I could have become famous if I didn't. My legal skills aren't as great as my psychological skills. I'm a member of the New York Bar, and I passed, I have a JD, but I was never as connected to the law as I was to psychology. So I had a client, a small woman who was a controller. She ran a control tower for the MTA, the subways. And that's a safety sensitive job. And they passed, the Supreme Court decided that it was legal to make the intoxication level for that 0.02. The normal, originally it was 0.10, and then it became 0.08 for driving. So it means if you touch alcohol, you're in trouble. So the woman had a beer at lunch. She came in, she tested 0.02, about exactly. They sent her for another testing, and it was below 0.02, but she was gone. And so they sent her to rehab. That's just the way it worked. And she sort of viewed it as like, stupid me. I shouldn't have had a beer before I went to work. This is kind of like my punishment. I got to do it. And she went and she hated it, but she did, whatever, 4 weeks or 2 months of rehab. Then she came back and they said, well, we're not going to test you randomly. And if you ever drink again, that's called a relapse, because all of the employee assistance people at the MTA were, of course, recovering people. Said, where's that coming from? I mean, okay, I shouldn't have had a beer before work. That's just the way, the nature of the game. And so she embarked on a 6-year period where they test people regularly and randomly at the MTA for alcohol. And they would never let go of her. And the reason they would never let go of her is she would show up with her EAP counselor, and they'd say, well, you're an alcoholic. He said, well, I'm not an alcoholic. Nobody in the world thinks I'm an alcoholic. You can't find anybody who knows me thinks I'm an alcoholic. And they say, that's denial. Denial is the critical aspect of coercion, because if people try and reason and say, well, okay, I shouldn't have been drunk driving, I shouldn't have done X or Y, But you're not allowed to say that. It denies your own reality. And so for 6 years, they strung her along, forcing her to take these random tests on the basis of the fact that she was an alcoholic, and she hired, and her basis for denying it was that she didn't feel the state could define for her who she was, who her identity was. She didn't use a legal argument. Now, that's an argument that's, I think, grown in proportion. That's now an argument, for example, around gender identification. The courts have now been saying, well, you can't tell people what their gender is. You're not allowed to do that. That's their decision. They're allowed to decide who they are. And I could have anticipated that. I tried to make that argument, but I just wasn't skillful enough. So I took it to the Second Court of Appeals, which had ruled against coerced AA treatment. And I said, this isn't the coerced AA treatment. They're coercing her to identify herself as an alcoholic. And she says she's not an alcoholic. And so I went in front of a panel of federal judges, appeals judges. And when I got there, I knew what I had to say at the outset, as I say, this woman is not an alcoholic. Nobody thinks she's an alcoholic. This is not about allowing her to continue drinking on the job. This is an identity thing. And the judges were kind of laughing, and they turned to the defense counsel for the MTA, and they said, how long has she been out of work? And the counsel said, she's not out of work. And all the judges go, what? Because they're thinking, oh, this is some alcoholic who's trying to get her job back, and they're not letting her. And the defense counsel, who was, I won't say she was sympathetic to me, but she knew this woman was an alcoholic. She said, she's never stopped working. She still pilots. There's nothing more sensitive than a control tower at the MTA in the subways. You know,
her defense was sort of like, no, she is working. I mean, maybe she is, maybe she isn't an alcoholic. But look, Dr. Peel's just trying to be a pain in your ass right now. What are they doing with your time?
Well, what her defense would be, well, the EAP controls her, and they've said that she needs to go for 6 years. I'm not going to say she's an alcoholic. I'm just defending the EAP's right to decide that she has to keep attending these EAP sessions and declaring that she's an alcoholic. It's a tricky issue to define. And remember, I was the moving party, so I have to make a case. The defense doesn't have to make a case. They're doing it. This is just the way we do it. You know, prove us wrong. And, you know, I didn't succeed. They were all laughing. And as I said, when the woman said, well, she's still working a safety tower, they were all stunned because they're all working on the assumption she's an alcoholic. And really what the defense counsel is saying is, well, we sort of don't think she's an alcoholic. She runs a tower. If you came here, this case, the second, it was in Brooklyn. If you came here by subway, she might have been directing the tower that directed your subway off of one curve or another, or off one switch or another.
And yet, who could argue with the professionals?
Right. They've decided this, and she matured out of her sentence after 6 years. I wasn't able to curtail it. And I failed to make the identity argument. But let's take it one step further. Even there are plenty of people who are supposedly sympathetic to people with drinking problems, certainly even drug policy reformers who are great supporters of AA. And them, you know, as you're aware, you can't go to an AA meeting and say, well, I'm thinking about whether I'm an alcoholic, or I don't think I'm an alcoholic, or I think I'm a drinker who's had some problems. Those aren't options. And yet all of these people jump in with 2 feet on the right of AA to tell an individual, you are an alcoholic and you must declare you're an alcoholic, whether or not you believe it. And of all the, AA and MAT, people love them, but they're predicated on the right and the ability of a group or a medical provider to say, you must decide that you're an addict and we're going to decide to treat you. This gets back to Oregon had a proposition that everybody says decriminalize drugs, but it doesn't quite. If you're caught with drugs, you're then sent to an addiction and treatment evaluation panel who can decide for you, well, we've decided you do need treatment. And this is accepted by people who would recoil at the idea of somebody saying, well, we're going to tell you what your gender is or what your race is or what your religion is. But a person's not allowed to say, well, I realize it's possible, I don't think I misuse narcotics. That's one possible thing they could say. And then they'll say you're in denial. And then you could say, well, I'm AA doesn't work for me. I want to try it. I'm not religious. And then people make excuses about that. And in MAT, they'll say, well, I don't want to tackle my problem externally. I don't want to feel the only way I can regulate my behavior is by taking another substance to substitute for the substance that I'm supposedly out of control of. That's just not how I want to live my life. Somebody might say, honestly, for me personally, if I declare myself out of control of my life that way, I just as soon be addicted. That declaration about being out of control is something I just won't do with my life.
Right.
And people in the drug policy reform movement, progressives who would be very sympathetic to some human being making that statement about their own agency and wanting to be in control of their own lives, when it slips into the addiction, narcotic, heroin, painkiller category and alcohol categories, they say, oh, screw that, throw that out the door. We're going to force them into a treatment.
Right.
So you're a more centrist character than me. Has something occurred to you lately that has made you more aware of the degree of coercion around you in regards to these things?
People have reached out since we wrote our book, and they've been telling me a lot of stories. And even though I know, let me say this, I'm pretty aware of when movements take hold that are bad movements, that they're going to have catastrophic outcomes. And I'm sensitive to that more than maybe some other people are, unless they see the carnage. But something about a lot of the stories I've been hearing lately about just how arduous a task it's been to keep up with different treatments. And then had this conversation with the psychologist that I told you about, Dr. Barnett. Recently he mentioned actually, I'll pull back a little more. Right around the time that you were helping me understand the downsides of MAT. And bless you, I'll say you let me come to conclusions on my own. And you even said one time, like, hey, believe what you want to believe. We're not going to junk our relationship over a disagreement about something like this. But look, I'll send you the facts. I'll send you stories. I'll tell you what I know is true. And at that point, I was more of a centrist person on this issue. And Rick, actually, he and I met over a Twitter spat about this. And I was on the sort of Maya Solovitz wagon saying, oh, I hate this. All right, I'll admit it. I was on the quoting the 50% or more number that MAT people cite. Well, MAT saves 50% of lives or more everywhere it's deployed, even though there's no real good there's clinical literature on that, but there's no worldly evidence for it.
We're in a world where people are able to say, we have more Suboxone and methadone prescription. It's being given out by individual providers. It's available close to universally. Unfortunately, more and more people are dying of drugs. What an odd coincidence.
Right.
In September, from September 2019 to September 2020, half of during the pandemic, 87,000 people died, which is by 4 times the number of people annually dying as was occurring at the turn of the century. So they're forced to juggle.
Right.
Oh, we've got a great treatment. It's not available everywhere, but it sure is a lot more available than it used to be. Unfortunately, more and more people are dying, and that death rate's accelerating.
And those folks have sort of conjured a ghost where there sometimes isn't one. So the argument is, oh, all these people who think that people can't take other drugs, they're horrible, they're heinous individuals. And you're lumped into that category, and now I'm lumped into that category because we say MAT doesn't seem to be solving all our problems. So Rick, Dr. Barnett actually convinced me on this. It was bubbling up for a while, but he put it in perspective because he's local. And I was able to start looking at, he sent me data and I looked at it. And I was convinced that the clinic that my wife Samantha works for was doing wonders, because they are doing wonders for some people. But overall, it didn't look like things were trending in a better direction. And he showed me that. And then he started telling me stories about people who come into his office who they get this nice choice. Well, you can go to jail, or you can go into this medication-assisted treatment. And a lot of people don't want a Vivitrol shot in their ass, and a lot of people don't want to take, like you were saying, methadone forever. People don't like, either at the onset or sometime in the middle of their therapy, they don't like the idea that they are being told that they don't have agency, or they can't make new choices, or they can't, unbuckle from that program and then go off and do something else. Once they're locked into it, they have a lot of supports, and they don't know where else to get those supports. It's kind of like being in a cult, like Aaron Ferguson talks about. And so they're saying, well, you can stay with us. You can leave.
Break out of it. It's the same as breaking out of AA.
Right.
You're told that you're wrong, that you're misguided, that you're not in control of your own thinking. And that's a therapeutic organization is convincing people that they're not in control of their own lives, and they cannot be in control of their own lives. It gets down to being something like, if that was what my job, well, I don't want to put it down anybody you might know whose job that is. I couldn't do that job to people. And if it was only, and maybe some people, if you had there are some clients who aren't going to make it on their own, and there's some clients who are. I mean, that's a fair statement. And it's sort of like, the criminal justice system. Well, a lot of people claim they're not guilty, and some are guilty and some aren't guilty, but we really lean on, in the American system, making sure that we don't send innocent people to jail. Perhaps sometimes we are in the opposite direction. That's so much my feeling. To see somebody trapped in an identity that's not true, it pains me so much that, if there's going to be some errors, I've got to eliminate that mistake, that error.
Right. So, people are in that position. You can leave anytime you want. It's fine, but you'll have to go to jail. Or you can leave anytime you want, but, these nice supports you have, you don't really get them unless you're taking the drugs we're prescribing. There are exit plans for people, and there are goals. Really good people are working in these organizations, so they want them to succeed. And if success means, tapering off drugs, they can get them to do it. So there has to be a middle ground, but there has to be some way to position yourself as someone who allows for that and thinks that's reasonable, but doesn't allow for coercion and doesn't allow for limitation of people's freedoms, or trying to feed people a story or force people to regurgitate a story about themselves that really isn't themselves. So when Dr. Barnett asked me, I copped to it, and I told him that thanks for helping me see that a little better. And ever since I've been working with Stanton, I've just been inundated with new stories and new data that show me that this is not a good system overall. Pushing the system the way it is now, it's not a good idea. It's not doing us better. We're not solving our problems. We're locked into the same old stories in drag. And he asked me, well, what's the thing about AA? I mean, in MAT, you're forcing people to take a pill. You can't do that in AA. And I'm realizing, yeah, but you can force people to swallow an ideology. There's no difference. There's a difference in the mechanism, but there's no difference in the style of rhetoric, and there's no difference in the limiting people's ability to pursue what they want in life, which America is all about. And I think just anyone who has good Enlightenment values should be all about.
Can you talk a little bit clinically, if somebody comes to you and they're uncertain about, well, am I an addict, or do I need MAT? Is that the only way I'm going to get better, or the 12 step? How do you give them the space to consider that freely? How do you allow them to think it through, given that they're expressing uncertainty or they're getting pressure one way or the other?
I'm always curious about how they reach those conclusions and not other conclusions. So I usually take them backwards a little bit and say, let's talk about your options. Let's talk about what's going on in your life. Why are you seeing me? Obviously there's some sort of problem you want to sort out. And usually people don't really know me. Maybe they've heard of me somewhere. What is it that you think I can do to help you? I mean, are you looking for an identity, or are we looking to unpack some of the areas of your life that you want to sort out? There are things that are to be sorted out in somebody's life. There are always different packages, different ways that they can go about that if they think them through. So I try to break it down to first principles, and let's let's forget the label for now. Let's pretend addiction isn't a thing, or medicines aren't a thing, whatever. What are your options and resources, and what do you want to do?
You'll break it down to the basics and say, well, I'm not going to call you an addict or an alcoholic. That's sort of not my job. My job is to look at the elements of your life and see how we can make those work better for you. And as you progress and see where you end up, we can make any, ultimate decisions you want to make about, like, well, what do you want to call yourself? Or what kind do you want to embark on, some kind of a formal treatment? Do you want to label yourself? We'll allow, that's your bailiwick. My bailiwick is to help you gain control of and improve your life so that you can make an informed decision. And that decision is your decision.
I told you, you asked me to send you a writing sample one time. And I think I sent you like 30 pages overnight. And it was just after I told you about different diagnoses that I've had, and that I had ADHD. And the first thing you said back was, you got a lot done for someone with ADHD in a short amount of time for someone with ADHD. That's how I approach people. I wouldn't tell somebody, you don't have this label, or you're wrong about this. I would just might point out, that's like a motivational interviewing kind of thing. I just might point out, well, a lot of times this label, it bleeds into like these areas, but you're telling me you're really skilled in these areas. So yeah.
That issu's come up lately. The Emmanuel brothers are the most famous brothers in America. One was the mayor of Chicago, and I met him when I worked at Above and Beyond. And he was a chief henchman for Obama coming out of Chicago. His brother, Ezekiel Emmanuel, is a professor of oncology and, philosophy of treatment at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. So pretty top flight people. They have a third brother, Ari Emmanuel, who was the basis of was it the HBO series about the Hollywood agent? And so everybody referred to him as the Hollywood agent, and you sort of thought, well, not everybody can be a genius like his two brothers. But lately it's become clear that he's created a mass international conglomerate involving both Israelis and Saudis. And he just did an IPO that gained, I don't know how many billions of dollars. And all of a sudden people are saying, wait a second.
He's the mastermind. Yeah.
You got the wrong Emmanuel brother.
Right.
Ruling the world. And he had ADHD, and Emmanuel, I've heard his brother, the Penn professor, say, oh, he really needed help. He was, he wasn't a great student like me, his other brother. And thank God he was diagnosed with ADHD. But in the New Yorker did a gigantic long piece about him. And what he said was, well, he didn't mention being medicated. He mentioned that he had ADHD. And one thing he said was, well, once I became, an agent, I would take scripts home every night and read them. And the joke was he couldn't really read, but then he could read when it made sense to him and it counted. And then he said, but I tell people who are diagnosed with ADHD, and I think you've had the same exact experience, thinking in a lot of different directions at once, that can be good. In other words, if you're just marching down the straight path, okay, it's fine. But there are other areas where they haven't really worked everything through, and coming up with new wild thoughts that might be realized if you learn how to put them together and make that a reality, that could be a good way of thinking too. I'm extrapolating from what he was saying, why is one a disease and the other not a disease? They're different styles of thinking. And our job, it's hard to change a person's style of thinking, but it's possible to give them faith in who they are, to recognize that they have skills, that their way of doing things is worthwhile, and to find avenues for them to do that in a fruitful way. And you are forced, your job is to deal with young people. And young people are kind of figuring out, well, what do I do in life? Who am I? And in that case, it seems so much more obvious that to label them as having a disease and telling them, well, this is the way you should be thinking, this is the way you should do everything, is just counterproductive to try and help a human being grow and develop.
And it doesn't take much of a leap to go from you should do all of this to you must do all of this.
Right.
You were talking about this lady who had to extend her 6-year, whatever her sentence was, before she could get back on track. I was talking to a nurse. Actually, he was on the podcast, the LPP podcast. His name is Bill Kinkle, who was, he admitted to the nursing board that he had an issue and he wanted to get treatment for it. And just there wasn't a thing at work. He admitted this. And so he's had to be drug tested and go to AA support groups for the past 5 years before he could get his license back. And, those are people who, you mentioned this before, doctors, nurses, people who are in those kinds of professions. Well, this isn't good. You don't want people to be forced to, pee in a cup to prove their worth for years at a time when some common sense attributes could just prove that for you. But you get down to the people, and this is often the case with MAT, who are really the most disparaged and down on their luck, have the heaviest cognitive load and burden. They don't have a leg to stand on to argue or to, just dispute the claim that they are whatever the label is bestowed upon them. And that's where it gets insidious for me. It's people might think,
and of course children are taken from parents all of the time,
right?
And they're taken from poor people. I mean, the only way a rich person's drug addiction becomes an issue is if they're in a big divorce case, and then the spouse says, "Oh, they're addicted," because well-off people are able to compensate. They can get help. Help meaning, well, they can get help looking after their children. They, can have people drive them around the car. They're not going to get arrested on the street. And so these diagnoses are extremely class-based. A job I had was working as a lawyer for the family court, the public defender's office for family court. And there are only poor people in that court. Rich people, even middle-class people, don't end up there. The state's not taking kids away from middle-class people. And it's funny,
right.
Everybody says, well, people are all equally likely to be addicted. They say that, but those courts are just poor people. And, you're sort of, they're behind the 8 ball. in many areas of their lives. And it's just in an era, and race is, of course, one big determinant, in an era where we're so aware of inequality, where we talk about Black and poor lives mattering, this is one gigantic area where often progressives are implicated in making those lives not matter, of putting those people down, saying they aren't going to be able to be in control of themselves. And, and allowing things like having their children taken from them, what could be worse than that?
So it doesn't, it's unsettling when people hear, oh, addiction's not a disease, or, we have the title is cheeky instead of disease therapy, and people get bent out of shape about that. And I know you're publishing your memoir sometime soon, and that's been sort of your life's work, for better or worse, is that you kind of want to say, look, all of you people living in a common sense world, I know that if you just took your own common sense, you don't have to know anything crazy. If you held my hand long enough and let me give you a tour of the landscape that is addiction in our America, in your own lives, and its possible consequences and the stories we've told about it, you would see, if you were able to cling on long enough, that common sense all the way down. There is no need for the magical stories. We could do better than this. And, people don't like to go that far because it's nicer to think nice things. And if it doesn't affect you, then there's no really need to get yourself into the weeds and think about, systemic issues and human rights issues and all the things we're doing wrong.
Well, you really put that very well, and thank you for that lead into my book. And I think this ties everything up in a neat bundle. We get back to the stories that we are told that we accept. Sometimes, even though those stories contradict our own lives, like, well, I took painkillers, I didn't become addicted. Well, I couldn't become addicted. I have children, blah, blah, blah. There were all these things in my life that prevented me from becoming addicted. But I know that people who take these painkillers, they just become addicted, or any narcotic, they can't help it. Well, I could help it, but other people can't help it. And so we're forced, the narratives that are broadcast all over our society, from cheesy television shows to inspirational movies, and even at the highest levels of progressive thinking, about how people are out of control of something that people themselves in their own lives control, is one example of how the myth outshines the reality.
One thing we were going to talk about, I know we don't have much time, but you and I met this weekend in Brooklyn, and you introduced me to your friend who is a jazz trumpet player, and he's like in awe of you. You're this genius psychology guy. Well, I'm just a musician. I could tell you some good stories about that. And he's telling us a story about how he's teaching to people in Sing Sing, and how difficult their lives have been, and how it's important to him to just really hone in and become attuned to these people and where they are and what they want, and so they can make their lives slightly better, or they could do it for themselves and find something they're interested in, so he could be a part of that. And we're both looking at each other like, well, that's sort of the best therapy of all, isn't there? And most people want to do that. Parents for their kids, for sure. Teachers, people just in life, they like to know that they're doing something meaningful for another person. And you don't need much more than that to be a great clinician.
He's a man who naturally wants to help others. So maybe we can end with one story. I've heard him tell this story a million times, and I told it again, and he corrected me this time. His father, who I think was just a salesman, I think he sold supermarket products. He wasn't a psychologist. His father said to him, I love you unconditionally. I hope you love me, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And this time, I told that story 100 times. John corrected me. John said, my father said to me, that's not the essential thing. He used the word essential. The essential thing is that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And John's parents are both still alive. He loves them. But John is in control of his own existence. I mean, he's a jazz musician. You have to be to get by in life. He's a man who, drinks beer fairly regularly, copiously, but he's never been out of control of his life, and he's been able to make it go of it. He has a lovely wife and a beautiful marriage. And it's all, this time I've told the same story a million times, but in raising a child and being a human being, the essential thing is feeling that you're in control of your own life. If you don't have that, you're going to be playing catch up and make up all the time. And coercion is a way of crushing people and telling them, you're not in control of your own life. We need to be in control of your own life. It's sort of like, it's not a big leap to saying that's similar to totalitarianism in politics.
I'll end by saying there's a guy named Simon Sinek. I don't really know what he does. I think he's a startup guy, but he's kind of a motivational speaker. I've said something similar to this before, but he's more famous, so I got to give him the coinage. He was talking to someone, asked him about mentorship and, well, what does it mean to be a great mentor? And he told a story that, well, he was talking to somebody who was a great mentor of his, and he said to him, "I'm really glad you're my mentor." And that person said back to him, "And I'm really glad you're mine." That kind of a connection in building people up, that's essential. Like, as John's father told him, that is essential. Not that you're telling somebody what they need to do, or that you have the ingredients and the recipe and they have to follow it. It's that it's helping individuals be able to take the reins of their own lives and build themselves up. And that's what we're all about.
Both in dealing with children and in the life process program and dealing with clients. That's the goal. That's the ideal. And it's possible for every human life. Well, okay. It's a, kind of almost a religious sermon on a Sunday, self-efficacy mount.
Yeah.
Adieu.